Good morning, afternoon, or evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Madhav Rajan. I'm the Dean and the George Shultz Professor of Accounting at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. I'm thrilled to welcome you to Chicago Booth's Road to Economic Recovery series. Wherever you're logging from, I hope you're all doing well during this unusual time. And I'm very grateful to you for taking the time to engage with the school in this fashion. We have a very special discussion planned today titled Vaccine Revolution, How Did It Happen and What's Next? And I'd like to thank Chicago Booth alumnus and Moderna CFO David Meline for being here to discuss issues related to the COVID-19 vaccine and what's going to happen next. My thanks also to Deputy Dean Randy Krosner for moderating today's chat. This is the third event in this Road to Economic Recovery series on COVID-19. Each event takes place virtually and includes a discussion with industry leaders, policymakers, and other experts from Booth and beyond to think about the challenges facing all of us as we go forward. So last July, we opened the series with a chat between Randy and Sir Mervyn King, former governor of the Bank of England, about rebuilding the global economy amid radical uncertainty. Then in October, Booth alum Ann Mukherjee, chairman and CEO of Pernod Ricard North America, and Brian Niccol, chairman and CEO of Chipotle, another Booth alum, discussed how consumer behavior has changed during the pandemic in a panel moderated by Booth professor JP Dubey, who oversees the Kilt Center for Marketing at Booth. We'll continue the Road to Economic Recovery series as the world continues to rebuild, and we will post details about future events on the Booth website, chicagobooth.edu, as plans take shape. Wanted to also let you know about another great event coming up. On April 30th, we will host our annual management conference. And this event, which is going to be online, will open with a keynote conversation between Booth alumni Cliff Asness, David Booth, and Gene Fama, who's of course also a faculty member at Booth, and moderated by our faculty member, Steve Kaplan. And these giants of the investment world are going to discuss their views on the current and future state of asset prices and investing. So we're also going to have other panels and session topics on things like big data in the classroom, the COVID vaccine, fake news, the future of the MBA, and lots of other interesting sort of sessions. So you can learn more about the management conference as well on the Booth website. So with that, I'm thrilled to introduce today's speakers. So as CFO of Moderna, David Meline oversees all of the financial, business development, and business services functions for the company. Before that, he served as CFO and EVP at Amgen from 2014 through 2019. And there, again, he was responsible for all finance, information systems, and global business service activities across 100 countries. Before that, he spent 6 years at 3M, where he also served as CFO and senior vice president, and was responsible for all of their financial activities across 70 countries. Prior to that, he held numerous leadership positions at GM, including vice president and CFO for GM North America. Thank you very much, David, for being here today.
Thank you for the invitation.
Sure. And Randy Krosner, who's our Deputy Dean for Executive Programs, the Norm Bobbins Professor of Economics at Chicago Booth. Randy served as a governor of the Federal Reserve System from 2006 until 2009. And he chaired the Committee on Supervision and Regulation of Banking Institutions and the Committee on Consumer and Community Affairs. Randy took a leading role in developing responses to the financial crisis and in thinking about new initiatives to improve consumer protection and disclosure. Thank you very much, Randy, and take it away.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Madhav. I'm delighted, thrilled to have David Meline with us and to have the third installment of our Road to Economic Recovery series that builds on our Economic Outlook series that we do around the globe. And so I wanted to start with, David, how in the world did you make the transition from Amgen, which is a very large company, you know, $20–30 billion of revenues, market cap of more than 100 billion, to something that until relatively recently no one had ever heard of? I mean, Moderna in 2019 had revenues under $100 million and a market cap less than 10 billion. How in the world did you make that transition?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Randy, and it's been a really exciting journey since I joined the company in June of last year. So if you go back to that time, the company, Moderna, was at a phase where it was in development, early development of this vaccine for the COVID-19 virus. And it looked quite encouraging in terms of the possibility of coming to market as soon as the end of 2020. The company was a development stage biotech company until that time, and the first product launch was expected more like 4 or 5 years in the future. So as they were looking at the possibility of becoming a very significant commercial company quite quickly, they reached out to me, and I had just finished my 6 years as the CFO at Amgen, so I knew the industry. I understood how to build global businesses, and they asked me to join them to help build out the company, which I thought, there would be no more interesting and exciting and impactful challenge that I could think of. So I decided to join, and it's been a great ride. And as we look at how the vaccine's being now distributed globally, it's quite satisfying to see the results thus far.
So let's take through this, because you said you've built global businesses before, but nothing like this. I mean, going from a trivial amount of revenues to contracts for $18 billion worth of revenues,
Right.
Tenfold increase in the stock price, just unprecedented growth. There's really no model like this. So how have you begun to manage this? Also, what I want to note is, please feel free to send your questions in. We've got a number of excellent questions that had already come in, and this is actually one of them, of like, how did you manage this growth from sort of zero to something enormous?
Yeah, so if you look at the company, when I joined, as I said, we were just in the phases of planning for what's called the phase 3 clinical trial, which was the trial that would be for 30,000 people to allow us to get approval for the vaccine. The company was made up largely of a research and development team. And so when I joined, then we started building out, we built out the manufacturing network, which is largely an externally sourced network where we're partnering with some capable manufacturers, including Lonza from Switzerland. We got contracting in place. We lined up raw materials to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars of committed supply. We then were in discussions with governments around the world who, by the summer last year, were very anxious to start contracting with us, even though the technology was not yet proven out. But obviously, we're in the middle of the pandemic already, so there was a huge amount of interest in contracting, which we did through the summer into the fall. We got the results then from the trial in the fall and got approval under an emergency use authorization to launch in December, which we did. And as you mentioned, we announced the signed contracts that we have in place for 2021 deliveries right now stand at about $18 billion. So far, so good. We've delivered 67 million doses thus far, on the way to 100 million in the US this first quarter, and 15 to 25 million internationally.
Amazing. And so, and this is also one of the questions that had come in. So my understanding is that you had basically never created a commercial dose before or delivered one before. And suddenly you're doing hundreds of millions, if not a billion, in a short period of time. And so take us through like a particular challenge of something that you had to unlock that, of course, the company had never done before, some challenge that you were facing. And then how did you sort of deal with unlocking that challenge to go from zero to a billion?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you think about what we've been doing, normally the development that occurred over a matter of months. We would typically build out over about a decade. So what you end up doing is doing a number of things in parallel. And I think importantly, if you look at the investment thesis, we were taking risks in terms of investing in advance of when you normally would. So normally when you develop a product like this, you go through a series of trials, phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3. You then take incremental investment and scientific risk as you go along. In this case, because of the urgency of the pandemic situation, we did these steps in parallel. In the case on the scientific side, it was with close cooperation with the FDA in the US and the health agencies around the world, because you're monitoring safety as you go, because you can't compromise in any way the safety of the product and for those patients who are in the trials. So we were doing that in a number of cases in parallel, where you typically do it over a longer sequential period. And then in the same time we were investing. So we were investing in lining up commercial supply, and actually we're producing product as early as last summer, which meant that if it wasn't ultimately approved and launched, we would have had loss of those investments. But fortunately, the product came through with very high efficacy, 94% efficacy rates, which is amongst the best vaccine efficacy that's been seen in history. And we were able to launch the product successfully, and therefore able to ramp very quickly because we'd taken the risk to invest and be ready for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think many people don't realize that traditionally the FDA would approve a vaccine if it's like 50 to 60% efficacy. I mean, this is extraordinarily high. How is is a lot of your contracts with government, and so we had a couple of questions come in about this, about dealing with kind of the political economy of government contracts, and then in particular, what was the role of Operation Warp Speed? Was that helpful? What did that do for you? How did that help you to do your investments?
Yeah, so if you look at the, first of all, I would say it's a really great example of a public-private partnership that's really worked incredibly well. So again, if you look at the number of people in the US who have now been vaccinated and the rollout that's occurring, it's very much an outcome of those investments and that risk-taking that was done jointly together. So the US government made a decision to place bets, if you will, on 3 different technologies where they invested with and contracted with 2 producers for each of those technologies, because they recognized that it was unknown as to how quickly and how efficacious each of those vaccine candidates would be. In our case, as you said, as a company that was a startup biotech company without a history of products, we didn't have the benefit of a global network. We didn't have the infrastructure in place. We didn't have the manufacturing. We didn't have a credit rating. And so the support we got in the partnership with the US government was critical to our ability to then progress quickly with, again, the result of a very efficacious vaccine. The original target and the guidance from the FDA was that they would be approving vaccines to the extent they achieved a 50% threshold of effectiveness or higher. And again, obviously, we came at the high end of the range, so that was very satisfying. And because of this mRNA technology we're using, we were also able to get to market quickly, and the results have been, very encouraging.
Yeah, I think it's a very, very interesting innovation to think about how, because we usually think of governments providing some sort of insurance function. And here what they did is they said, okay, we don't know which technology is going to work. And we need to have some, this is so important publicly that we'll take a chance on a whole bunch of them. Some may work, some not. And it was crucial for you to be able to put the pieces together, because you had no track record. You had very little, very few resources, and so I think that that's really an amazing transformation. And as you said, I think a very clever use of public funds to try to help the private sector to solve public health problems. But you mentioned the technology and the mRNA technology. So let's take us back to the origin of the vaccine revolution. My understanding is that Moderna was able to figure out what vaccine it wanted to use in 2 days. That just seems like something out of science fiction. Is that true? And how did that happen?
Yes. So if you look at the technology, which has been under development now for about a decade, the thesis is that what you can do is basically RNA is the messenger instructions that come from DNA to the body to produce proteins. And so the insight that was developed then was, if you can reprogram RNA, the messenger RNA, to give the body instructions to produce a certain type of protein, that's how you can then develop a drug candidate. And so that's what we did in this case. This was the 10th vaccine candidate that is been developed and put into clinical trials by Moderna. But of course, the first one that's now gotten to market, in part because of the urgency of this pandemic crisis. But back to your question. So yes, the answer is, once the genome of the virus was published on the internet by the Chinese authorities last year, within 2 days, then we were able to design the mRNA sequence and the vaccine. We then went into production, an initial production run, and we delivered 42 days later to the NIH the first vaccine that could be then used in the first trial. So, a very interesting technology, in part because of the speed. And if you look now, with the variants that have started developing, we've started some trials a couple of weeks ago, including a modified version of the vaccine that's specifically designed to address the .351 variant that originated in South Africa. So we believe this technology will be very effective in terms of its adaptability to accompany the evolution of this virus, which we think will continue. So we're very optimistic that we have a technology that's going to contribute strongly going forward to address diseases of this type.
I mean, the speed is just amazing, because it was Watson and Crick in Cambridge, UK, who came up with the understanding of the structure of DNA. And then it was decades before we started being able to sequence the genome. And now it's something that we identify the virus, the genome is published a short time after, and in a couple of days you figure out what you want.
Yeah, I mean, if I could comment, I think there's something very exciting going on right now, which is the knowledge and understanding of biology continues to improve quite dramatically as we move through time. The capability of computing and the decline of computing costs is also contributing, and those are coming together to unleash this type of development, which I think is very exciting frankly, for humanity.
Yeah, I think this is just amazing, and so let's pick up on your point on what's next, and so on the mutations and the variants. So, what is your view of? We had got a question on this. We had a number of questions about what's going to be happening with the mutations and what will that mean for public health. So, how do you see the role of just the vaccine rollout in general affecting whether there will or won't be mutations and variants, and then what can Moderna and others do to try to respond to that?
Yeah, so I would say, first of all, we do expect that this coronavirus will continue to be present and will not be eradicated in the foreseeable future. If you look at other coronaviruses that have not been as serious, you see them continuing to exist and mutate. So we expect that will continue with this virus as well. The good news is we have been testing against these new mutations, and thus far we've seen that our current vaccine is effective against all of the major mutations that have been identified. So that's encouraging. But we're keeping an eye on this because the open, unanswered question is around the durability of the vaccine. So we're monitoring that. And then, as I said, we've started some additional trials in the last couple of weeks, where what we're doing is we're looking at the effect of a booster shot of the existing vaccine. So we give 2 injections in a course of treatment. We're then giving a 3rd injection as a booster to raise the level of antibodies and observe the effectiveness of that against these new strains. Secondly, we've done a modified version of the mRNA vaccine, which is specifically targeted against the .351 version coming out of South Africa. So we're testing that, and then there's a 3rd arm of the trial, which has got a combination of the existing plus the .351, and we'll see what the results are from those trials in the relative near term. So, but we do think that there's a reasonable likelihood that you'll see a booster shot recommendations, perhaps as soon as by the end of this year.
And what role will the FDA and the US and the other health agencies play in allowing for this rapid time for you to sort of try these new things out and then actually get it into people's arms?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we're working very closely, as you can imagine, with the U.S. health authorities, including the FDA, as well as many of the health authorities around the world. The cooperation has been very good. Obviously, it's a huge priority around the world, and so we're working very collaboratively and on, frankly, a 24/7 basis with these people around the world, given the urgency of the situation. So obviously, all of these trials that we're now launching have been designed and done together in cooperation with the health authorities, and they're monitoring closely the results so that, again, we can, quickly move through the decision process, assuming success, to get these vaccines to market. And in this case, we're talking about boosters, which we believe there's a reasonable likelihood they'll be necessary.
And so we've had a number of questions come in about the potential tension between profit motive and public health, and so how have you been thinking about that? Because obviously, getting the vaccine out quickly to as many people as possible is an extremely valuable thing from a public health perspective, but obviously you have to make sure that Moderna is viable. And so how do you think about those kinds of trade-offs, given the important role that you play and so the public health, you and the others who've created the vaccines play in public health?
Sure. Yeah, so as we've already talked about, I think it's a great example, this situation of a successful public-private partnership where there's been not only if you will, co-investment as they've underwritten the phase 3 trial for us and the other manufacturers. But there's also the risk taking that's taken place as we've been taking risk with our private shareholder investment, and of course we've contracted with a number of countries who were willing to give us at-risk down payments against their orders to enable them to get an allocation of the product as it's produced. So we've seen a very close collaboration and risk-taking that there's been a willingness to undertake. I think, it's a very unusual situation, and we think that it's likely, at least in the US, as this evolves to a more stable endemic phase of this virus, that you'll see then it's defined yet, but it's reasonable to think that you'll have a private market develop that goes along with it as we move to the next phase. So not determined yet, but I think it's reasonable to expect that to develop going forward, like you have for other vaccines for other diseases.
Because this is interesting because it seems like the main or perhaps the only purchaser, at least in the short run, have been governments. And one of the questions came in is, should private markets and private organizations be able to access the vaccine and then either resell it or use it for their companies, their organizations?
Yeah, so until now, our customers have been the governments and health authorities around the world who have taken the responsibility to contract and make the product available to their citizens. We have two supply chains that we've set up. One is a US-based production that is until now exclusively for distribution within the US borders. And then we have a supply chain that was set up in collaboration with our manufacturing partner Lonza, which is a Swiss-based company, and their primary production location is in Switzerland. And that is the source of product for our international contracts. So we have those in place. As I said, until now, it's been a government business, but we do expect that as we go through phases of this and get past the pandemic phase, at least in some countries, it would be likely that you would see a transition to a private market, which would be, we're preparing for that likelihood, in fact.
But you think that's a ways off?
It's a little unclear right now as to the precise timing. But if you look at the speed at which you're seeing supply develop at least in the US, I think it could be, sooner than later that we see that transition. In other parts of the world, it's likely it's going to be well into 2022 or beyond when you have initial coverage of vaccine. And I think that will dictate then the timetable in which the market develops.
Very interesting. And as you know, some of my colleagues, Eric Budish and Kenneth Prendergast, have been crucial in working with this international group, so-called COVAX, to try to ensure that vaccines are allocated globally, not just to a few of the wealthiest countries in the West. And if we might be able to put into the chat a link to their recent paper in Science on market design to accelerate COVID-19 vaccine supply. It's a very interesting way of trying to use market forces to achieve a social purpose. And so have you worked with COVAX, and what is your thoughts about COVAX?
Sure. Yeah, we've been working with COVAX since last year. So we made some initial proposals to them later in the summer last year. And we've continued to have a dialogue with them around supply. And we're very interested in that mechanism, in part because, again, think about this: a startup company, no existing commercial infrastructure around the world, certainly no presence in, let alone the US or Western Europe or Japan, let alone the developing markets around the world. So, very interested in how can we provide our product and access to our product to potentially all citizens. We recognize this as a responsibility of ours, and therefore, what are the means by which that can be accomplished? COVAX is clearly a mechanism by which we can access areas of the world that otherwise would be inaccessible to us. And so we've been very interested in working with them. What we've also seen, to be honest, is we've seen some of the countries that are COVAX participants come into us directly to contract recently. So we announced, I think within the last few weeks, a contract with the Philippines, a contract with Colombia. So we see various approaches which we try to be responsive to.
I think it's very, very interesting. I mean, there's so many interesting aspects of this, of sort of the role of the government in providing some sort of a risk-sharing function to allow you to do what you and others do. And then the issue of public health, because obviously there's, this is a classic externality kind of, and of course you want to protect yourself from the virus, but we want to give incentives for everyone to be protected against the virus globally, because it's not, as you're describing, mutations can come from anywhere and could come back to any country given global interconnections.
That's right. If I may, that's a very important observation, which is this question of access and equity and equitable distribution. The fact is that mutations arise from people that are infected who haven't been vaccinated. So until you have broad dissemination of vaccines, you can expect that you'll continue to see a very active evolution of the virus. And so there's some very strong reasons from a public health perspective to seek to broadly gain vaccinations for the entire world.
So we had a few questions come in around pricing of both how, since you're developing this so quickly, and how do you even think about pricing of something like this? And then how do you also take that into account in thinking about the benefits of just getting more vaccines out to people?
Sure. Yeah, so what we've sought to achieve is a balance on pricing, which is, if you looked at the traditional pharmacoeconomic modeling of the value of this vaccine to the economy, it leads you to some conclusions where you could see prices that are quite a lot higher than we're offering. And so what we've done is we've sought to balance our responsibility as a manufacturer to offer a fair price, which will generate a return on investment to our investors, as well as allow us to continue to invest and take risk on additional developments, while also acknowledging and recognizing our responsibility to society by setting a price that meets affordability criteria, which we think we've achieved very well. If you compare the price of our vaccine to what it costs to get a test for whether you're infected or not, I think you would find that the vaccine is quite a lot cheaper than just getting a test. So I think that's validation that we've been able to strike that balance.
In the work that Eric Budish and Kenneth Prendergast co-authors have done, their rough estimate is that the global benefit from additional capacity is the order of $500 to $1,000 per dose. And from you and others, it seems the cost per dose is on the order of like $6 to $40.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. So I think that demonstrates the value that's being provided here by us and others.
There's a very, very interesting issue of how to try to get this right and make sure that we try to achieve that incredible social value of $500 to $1,000 and make sure to get that out. We had a few questions come in on just dealing with the political pressures, because obviously you're dealing with government contracts, and so there are issues there. And then you're dealing with governments who have different views, and some governments who wish they had contracted earlier than others. And so you and the others who are creating this vaccine can face a lot of political pressure. So how did you deal with that in thinking about the initial contracting as well as going forward?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, if you look at the development of the vaccine at Moderna, it was quite straightforward. We'd been cooperating with the NIH. As I said, we'd done 9 previous developments of vaccines. So our technology was well known, at least to the US government health authorities. And so in that regard, we didn't have, if you will, political pressure. We had good cooperation and knowledge of the technology and support, because there was recognition that this technology, which had never been brought to the world previously, was likely to be very well matched with the needs of this type of a pandemic situation. So one can say we didn't have political pressure on that side. What is true is that we had lots of governments coming in looking to contract with us. You had some that were more forward-leaning and prepared to contract. And remember that this was a technology that was previously not available in the market. So depending on the knowledge of the health authorities and the government, I think there was a greater willingness to consider to contract early. Others that were, chose to depend more heavily on some of the traditional proven technologies. We didn't see them come in until later, when they saw that we got to market successfully and that, the efficacy was very high. So I'm very interested. Say today, there's a very strong and broad interest in mRNA technology. We and others are working very hard to continue to develop, given the proven applicability and high efficacy, and so far so good on safety. Looks very good in terms of the product.
It's really quite amazing that taking these fundamental ideas, Nobel Prize winning ideas from 1950s, and then it became so rapid in being able to implement this. This is exactly what we deal with at the Polsky Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurship, of trying to take the ideas that scientists and researchers have, and then actually bring them into practice. And this seems like just an amazing example where we bring together traditional science, computation, and data analysis, the big data, putting it all together.
No, that's right. I think it's a great example of innovation and the power of innovation. Moderna was named by Fast Company last week as the most innovative company in 2020 in the world, and I think that's exactly right. I think it's a really exciting example of the power of innovation and what can be accomplished.
So are there broader lessons, because we've talked a lot about, the specific challenges, the amazing challenges that you have faced in going from 0 to 18 billion or 0 to a billion doses, but for others who may not have quite the same rapid growth that you've had, but are trying to deal with innovation and trying to deal with rapid growth. Are there some general lessons we can draw from this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I would say my observation first is it's an incredible triumph of science. So you see what's being done here. Imagine in the absence of this innovation, the situation the world would be facing with this pandemic today, right? A wonderful example of the power of science. Secondly, I would say more specifically, it's been a unique opportunity to bring to market this mRNA technology, which is new to the world and had been under development for a number of years. Perhaps serendipity that we were at a point of development that coincided with the arrival of this, COVID-19 virus, and we were able to respond to it. So that's very exciting. Thirdly, I would observe, and we've talked about this public-private partnership, and when it functions effectively, the power of that to address big public health issues, I think we think is very exciting and a good example of cooperation leading to, real economic benefit for the world. So, you look, we're 1 year almost to the day into this pandemic, and we're optimistic that you can see, the sun, starting to appear on the horizon, and it's very much the result of the efforts of all of these things to address this pandemic.
Yeah, it's very interesting to think about because there's a lot of debate on the role of government in innovation. Of course, people have talked about ARPA and DARPA in the US. The UK has just created something called ARIA based on that sort of model, which is about high risk taking and the expectation that most projects will not succeed because if you never miss an airplane, you spend too much time waiting in the airport. You're not taking enough risk. But it seems, traditionally government has not been very good at being able to take risk, and it seems that this may be a breakthrough on a much better model going forward. And that's where I want to think about two sets of questions coming in. First is, how do we make this sustainable? So there've been a lot of innovations with the FDA and other authorities in the world to be able to speed trials, a lot of innovations in sort of government risk sharing to try to solve important public policy problems. Is this something that you think will just disappear when we get this under control? If not, or if so, how can we try to make sure that doesn't happen? We sustain these.
It's a great
on the
question.
policy side.
Yeah. I mean, as you can imagine, there is a lot of interest amongst governments right now around the world to exactly address the question you're raising, right? Because the sustainability of effort tends to dissipate when the crisis passes, right? You move on to the next crisis of the day.
Yeah.
And so how do you sustain the effort of preparedness is the key question that governments are wrestling with right now. We have some level of optimism here that this type of technology, which is a platform technology, and therefore you can use the same processes, you can use the same production equipment for different vaccines for these different viruses. If you lower the barrier and the cost of preparedness, if you will, that starts to unlock the possibility of better preparedness going forward. So those are the areas that are being explored right now. Is there a means by which you can ensure that you are as prepared as possible while still being responsible with the type of investment that one needs to sustain. And I think there's something there that is very exciting.
You know, I think it's really gotten us to think much more carefully about risk management, because the FDA had operated in an extraordinary risk-averse way, and there are historical reasons for that. They had made some steps forward with HIV/AIDS because people were dying, and so the FDA said, "Well, we can take a few more risks in some of these trials because we know this person will not make it in 6 months, but let's try because we may get something good." And now we're doing further expediting of these things. So I'm hopeful that we will learn permanent lessons on better risk management, because I'm not sure that we had the optimal risk management from before. But this gets us to what's next. And you mentioned that I've got a zillion questions on what's coming for our mRNA vaccines, because you mentioned the platform that you're able to do these. I know that there's been some discussion of potential cancer vaccines, HIV/AIDS, a whole variety of things. So tell us about what's potentially
Yeah,
next.
thank you. Thanks, Randy. So if you look at the pipeline that Moderna has under development, it's very exciting. We have 24 candidates in the pipeline. I think 13 of those are already in the clinic, so in trials. And they cover a diverse set of diseases where you have high unmet needs. So we've got cancer vaccines that we're working on, which we're very excited about the possibility there. We've also got a set of activities around other autoimmune diseases. We've got additional vaccine candidates for the next version of this virus that we might see. We've got an effort in the cardiovascular area. The largest killer of people on the planet is cardiovascular disease, and we have a number of candidates there. And then finally, we've also got an effort underway against there are many rare diseases that occur in small sets of the population that we think that this technology, which can go after basically all of the proteins in the body instead of only a third of them, which is what traditional biotech can address, opens up the possibility of addressing a number of unmet needs. So if you look at the size of that pipeline, that's comparable to much larger biotech or pharma companies. As you've quoted all the figures, we're getting to be a bit bigger this year. I think we're approaching 1,500, employees now, which is about double what we were a year ago. So, it's very exciting what's going on.
Actually, some more questions came in on that last piece about about managing this. So how did you work with the senior management team on this? Because you've got an interesting combination of people who are scientists and who really understand the technology, but understand the science. You've got data analysts who may not be PhDs in bio, but know the data very well. And then you've got yourself, with a great background at Amgen, but not being a scientist. So how do you get a team like that with very different strengths to work together in such a short period of time to create something like this?
Yeah, and on top of it, all being done over Zoom.
Oh, right.
Having never met any of my other fellow employees, we built this global company and are addressing this global pandemic. So, we think that's very exciting. We're not the only company who's dealing with this situation, but certainly it's been, a real challenge for everybody. But, the advantage sometimes of urgency is that it does break down the barriers to effectiveness. So, it's not unusual. We will be conducting a meeting of the day, any particular day, and there will be people on the call who will be contributing actively to the discussion and problem solving. And at the end of the meeting, we'll introduce ourselves because they've just joined the company. So it's been an incredible, build out. What we've tended to do, of course, is seek people with the level of experience and expertise in their particular specialty area to come in and help us to build out the business as we've gone. Again, the results, I think, speak for themselves. Obviously, the mission that we're on and the opportunity to contribute is, attracted some of the best and brightest in the world in their different areas of specialty. And then it's just about being clear and, get the communications right and understand the decisions we're making. My role, of course, is to understand the trade-offs and the risk-reward trade-offs financially. And I depend very heavily on my colleagues who can make similar types of trade-off decisions scientifically. And you put those together and you can see some success. And then the impact is apparent in terms of what's going on to address this pandemic.
No, and as you mentioned, it's truly amazing. Not only is this sort of unprecedented, kind of going from 0 to 18 billion, doubling your employees, producing a billion doses, and it's all on Zoom. That's even more astonishing that could have happened. Really, amazing. But when there were, as you said, you've got colleagues with science backgrounds. You're making they're making science trade-offs. How did you make the ultimate trade-offs? What is the way in which you do the decision making to make the final decisions when there may be differences in the way approach that you're taking, that scientists are taking, and that others in the company are taking? What is kind of the way your leadership work to and your leadership approach works to make those decisions?
It's a good question. So if you look at the company, again, we have the advantage of being small. So you can get the key decision makers around a single table. Everybody has their specific area of expertise that they bring to the table. And, you need to conduct, which Stefan Bancel does very effectively, our CEO, of allowing everybody to contribute to the debate, to make their points and offer their points of view. And then you seek to come to a consensus. And sometimes I vote yes, sometimes I vote no, but whatever we decide to go with, then we need to all get on board and support for success. And, check your ego at the door as you enter the room. So, it's worked very effectively. Again, the urgency helps a lot, right? The clarity of the mission and the situation at hand actually makes, in some ways, risk-taking and decision-making is easier than in other cases where the need is not perhaps as well defined.
I think that's a very important point because, you're making an amazing number of decisions in an extremely short period of time in areas where we really haven't explored before. But I think the ability to do that really comes from the clarity of the objective. And that's something that, we talk about a lot, sort of getting the question right. Because once you get the question right, once you get that clarity from that, then you can do your risk management around it. If you're not quite sure what you're trying to do, that slows down decision making. It also, then there's a lot more sort of office politics kinds of things that come in. When it's super clear and it's clear from the CEO, but from other organizations, the mission.
And if I may add, Randy, and you kind of take us back to our orientation at the University of Chicago, I'm a big believer in you do the analysis, you understand the alternatives, you understand the assumptions and inputs. Usually strategy is pretty easy once you've done that analysis, because more often than not, the answers clarify themselves as a result of doing that kind of a framework of analytics that, you know, I think is important. And I'm always a big believer in doing that framework, doing the analytics. And in my role as the CFO, you know, I always tell my people, I get the seat at the strategic table because I bring the data, right? And I may have an opinion, but you got to get it right. And you know, that's our role. And if you do it well, it helps to facilitate making good decisions.
So is that what you see as the main thing that you got from your booth training that's been helpful for you to deal with these amazing challenges?
Yeah, I think that's been, you know, very helpful. The training, the analytics, the dependency on preference for data and hard facts is you know, something that I learned at Booth and carried with me until today.
Oh, that's great. Anything else that you wanted to add? I mean, hundreds of questions that have come in, but are there any questions that we haven't touched on that you wanted to touch on, or issues you wanted to touch on?
No, I think you've covered a broad set. You know, again, very interesting. We'll look back, I think, at this as a case study and see you know, again, the triumph of science, the positives of this, you know, partnership between the private sector and the public sector, and the effective addressing of this pandemic. You know, in this case, by, you know, a small company that's been nurtured by the U.S. You know, system that encourages innovation and risk taking. I think it's a great example, and we should all feel very good about.
I think the key, as you said, is getting the risk-taking right, both on the public level and on the private level, because you're making trade-offs as a private company. Governments are making trade-offs from a public policy perspective, but also, you know, have many different political constituencies and interests that they are dealing with, and I think what I take from this is a great deal of optimism and hope that we can sustain some of the changes that have occurred in the process by which vaccines trials occur and are approved. Hope in terms of the new platform that you have that potentially could be applied to cancer, HIV/AIDS, and communicable diseases. That can be quite astonishing, and hope that we can get this behind us and get the economy back on a good sustainable. So thank you so much, David, for the generosity of your time and your thoughts. I know the world is looking to you and to Moderna for solving these problems that this pandemic issue that we're facing, and it's amazing how you've gone from basically a small startup to being one of the most important pharma players in the world. I really appreciate what you're doing, and I hope I can continue the conversation. Thank you so much.